Aristotle invented the science of logic in the 4th century BC as a systematic method of determining if an argument is properly reasoned. The purpose of this video is to teach you how to use the science of logic to identify and understand state crimes against democracy, popularly known as conspiracy theories. In his famous dystopian novel, 1984, George Orwell introduced the world to a concept called newspeak, which was a method of censorship used by Big Brother, government, to destroy words and ideas, thus narrowing the range of thought and making the population easier to control. It turns out that Orwell's idea of newspeak has a solid basis in reality. In his book, The Underground History of American Education, historian John Gatto argues very convincingly that though the science of logic is taught in elite private schools, it hasn't been taught in our state-controlled public schools for more than a century. He claims that our schools are designed to churn out drones and cannon fodder. Based on my own experience, I'm completely convinced that this is the truth. Due to our schools, the vast majority of Americans, even the elderly in our population, have no effective understanding of the science of logic or the art of rhetoric. The reason for the state to keep the science of logic out of the public schools seems fairly obvious to me. It's hard to lie to people who know how to logically evaluate an argument. You see, logically speaking, arguments are either deductively sound or inductively cogent, or they aren't. And you must evaluate the evidence for yourself before you can confidently decide which is the case. Calling an argument a conspiracy theory or anything else does not change that fact. With a population properly educated in the science of logic, a $30 billion scientific fraud, such as the supposed moon landing, would have never been possible. The immoral war waged over non-existent weapons of mass destruction could have never happened. The people who would have seen those deceptive government arguments for the fallacious nonsense that they were and are. Most of the dozens of books about logic that I read over the years were deliberately deceptive, omitting or misdefining key principles needed to reason logically. Finding a book that honestly teaches you how to properly reason is not such an easy proposition. I know now that this is not an accident. Dumbing down the masses is the name of the game. What follows is some of the most useful and valuable information about the science of logic and the art of rhetoric that I've been able to find after over a decade of research. Logic, therefore, is the science of thought, or the science of the process of pure reason, should be capable of being constructed a priori. Arthur Schopenhauer, The Art of Controversy. A priori is defined as deduced from self-evident premises. Logic, the science that investigates the principles governing correct or reliable inference. Webster's Unabridged Encyclopedic Dictionary. Infer, verb, to derive by reasoning, conclude or judge from premises or evidence. Webster's Unabridged Encyclopedic Dictionary. For logic is the science of those principles, laws, and methods which the mind of man in its thinking must follow for the accurate and secure attainment of truth. Celestine and Biddle, The Science of Correct Thinking, Logic. We suppose ourselves to possess unqualified scientific knowledge of a thing, as opposed to knowing it in the accidental way in which the sophist knows, when we think we know the cause on which the fact depends, as the cause of that fact and no other, and further, that the fact could not be other than it is. Aristotle, Posterior Analytics. We ought in fairness to fight our case with no help beyond the bare facts. Nothing, therefore, should matter except the proof of those facts. Aristotle, Rhetoric. Without the presentation of solid evidence, no argument can be a good one. Patrick Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, 1985, 2nd edition. Fallacious reasoning is just the opposite of what can be called cogent reasoning. We reason cogently when we reason 1, validly, 2, from premises well supported by evidence, and 3, using all relevant evidence we know of. The purpose of avoiding fallacious reasoning is, of course, to increase our chances of reasoning cogently. Howard Cahan, Logic and Contemporary Rhetoric, 1976, 2nd edition. The province of logic must be restricted to that portion of our knowledge which consists of inferences from truths previously known. Whether those antecedent data be general propositions or particular observations and perceptions, logic is not the science of belief, but the science of proof or evidence. Insofar as belief professes to be founded on proof, the office of logic is to supply a test for ascertaining whether or not the belief is well grounded. John Stuart Mill, A System of Logic. And if we have a right to know any truth whatsoever, we have a right to think freely, or, according to my definition, to use our understandings in endeavoring to find out the meaning of any proposition whatsoever, in considering the nature of the evidence for or against it, and in judging of it according to the seeming force or weakness of the evidence, because there is no other way to discover the truth. Anthony Collins, A Discourse of Free Thinking, 1713, taken from the first page of Thinking to Some Purpose by L. Susan Stebbing, 1939. The fallacy of suppressed evidence is committed when an arguer ignores evidence that would tend to undermine the premises of an otherwise good argument, causing it to be unsound or uncogent. Suppressed evidence is a fallacy presumption and is closely related to begging the question. As such, its occurrence does not affect the relationship between premises and conclusion, but rather the alleged truth of premises. The fallacy consists in passing off what are at best half-truths as if they were whole truths, thus making what is actually a defective argument appear to be good. The fallacy is especially common among arguers who have a vested interest in the situation to which the argument pertains. Patrick Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, 1985, second edition. An argument is a special kind of expression of inference, one that attempts to prove something on the basis of evidence. Patrick Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, 1985, second edition. The statements that make up an argument are divided into one or more premises and one and only one conclusion. The premises of the statements that set forth the evidence, and the conclusion is a statement that is claimed to follow from the evidence. Patrick Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, 1985, second edition. A sound argument is a deductive argument that is valid and has true premises. Both conditions must be met for an argument to be sound, and if either is missing, the argument is unsound. The qualification that the premises must be true means that all premises must be true. Because a valid argument is one such that if the premises are true, it necessarily follows that the conclusion is true, and because a sound argument does in fact have true premises, it follows that every sound argument, by definition, will have a true conclusion as well. A sound argument, therefore, is what is meant by a good deductive argument in the fullest sense of the term. Patrick Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, 1985, second edition. A cogent argument is an inductive argument that is strong and has true premises, and if either condition is missing, the argument is uncogent. A cogent argument is the inductive analog of a sound deductive argument, and is what is meant by a good inductive argument without qualification. Because the conclusion of a cogent argument is generally supported by true premises, it follows that the conclusion of a cogent argument is probably true. Patrick Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, 1985, second edition. Aristotle divides all conclusions into logical and dialectical in the manner described, and then into eristical. 3. Eristic is the method by which the form of the conclusion is correct, but the premises, the material from which it is drawn, are not true, but only appear to be true. Finally, 4. Sophistic is the method in which the form of the conclusion is false, although it seems correct. These three last properly belong to the art of controversial dialectic, as they have no objective truth in view, but only the appearance of it, and pay no regard to truth itself, that is to say, they aim at victory. Arthur Schopenhauer, The Art of Controversy. A high degree of probability is often called practical certainty. A reasonable man should not refrain upon acting upon a practical certainty as though it were known to be true. In England, for instance, it is customary for a judge at the trial of a person accused of murder to instruct the jury that an adverse verdict need not be based upon the belief that the guilt of the person has been proved, but upon the belief that the guilt has been established beyond a reasonable doubt. To be beyond reasonable doubt is to have sufficient evidence to make the proposition in question so much more likely to be true than to be false that we should be prepared to act upon the supposition of its truth. Many of our most important actions have to be performed in accordance with beliefs of such a kind. L. Susan Stebbing, Logic and Practice, 1934. Rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Aristotle. Rhetoric is the art of ruling the minds of men. Plato. Dr. Matson Peary defines a logical fallacy as any trick of logic or language which allows a statement or claim to be passed off as something that it is not. The ancient Greeks identified over 200 different logical fallacies. Here are some commonly used logical fallacies taken from the book The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric by Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., first published in 1937. Argumentum ad hominem. Argumentum ad hominem, literally an argument to the man, fallacy, confuses the point at issue with the people concerned. Attacks on the character and conduct of people and personal abuse or praise are substituted for reasoning on the point at issue. Argumentum ad hominem seeks to persuade by unsound ethos. In rhetoric, ethos means establishing the speaker or writer as one worthy of making an argument. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric, 1937. Argumentum and populum. The argumentum and populum fallacy arises from substituting an appeal to the passions and prejudice of the people for logical reasoning on the point at issue. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric, 1937. Argumentum ad misericordiam. The argumentum ad misericordiam, literally an argument to pity, fallacy replaces reason with a plea for sympathy. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric, 1937. Argumentum ad bacillum. Argumentum ad bacillum is the appeal to the big stick. The issue is ignored in an attempt to inspire fear of the consequences of adopting a proposed opinion or program, or of allowing a movement branded as dangerous to gain strength. The threat of social ostracism or loss of position might be used to deter a person from exposing fraud. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric, 1937. Argumentum ad ignorantium. Argumentum ad ignorantium is the use of an argument that sounds convincing to others because they're ignorant of the weakness of the argument and the facts that stand against it. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric, 1937. In the appeal to ignorance, argumentum ad ignorantium, one relies on a lack of knowledge on the part of the hearers to hinder them from seeing through the speciousness of one's arguments. Statistics are thus often used and abused by orators, knowing that the audience is not acquainted with the facts or with the proper interpretation of the figures. Speaking to an uneducated mass meeting, the speaker will frequently sway his audience with the fire of his enthusiasm and the grandiloquence of his language, convinced that the play on his words will do more than any amount of cogent reasoning. Celestine N. Biddle, The Science of Correct Thinking, Logic. Argumentum ad populum, ad misericordiam, ad bacillum, and ad ignorantium also demonstrate an unsound use of pathos. Pathos is a term used in rhetoric to mean that a speaker or writer tries to establish empathy with the audience. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, Rhetoric, 1937. Persuasion is achieved by means of logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos requires one to convince the minds of the listeners or readers by proving the truth of what one is saying. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric, 1937. Argumentum ad verecundium. Argumentum ad verecundium is an appeal to the prestige or respect in which a proponent of an argument is held as a guarantee of the truth of the argument. This is unwarranted when reasoning about an issue is required and only the authority of its upholders or opponents is given consideration. It is perfectly legitimate to supplement reasoning with authority, argumentum ad auctoritatem, but it's fallacious to substitute authority for reasoning in matters capable of being understood by reason. Sister Miriam Joseph, Ph.D., The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, Rhetoric, 1937. If you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life you doubt, as far as possible, all things. René Descartes. How's the dictionary getting on? Said Winston, raising his voice to overcome the noise. Slowly, said Syme. I'm on the adjectives. It's fascinating. He had brightened up immediately at the mention of newspeak. The 11th edition is the definitive edition, he said. We're getting the language into its final shape. The shape it's going to have when nobody speaks anything else. When we're finished with it, people like you have to learn it all over again. You think, I dare say, that our chief job is inventing new words, but not a bit of it. We're destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. The 11th edition won't contain a single word that will become obsolete before the year 2050. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there'll be no words in which to express it. George Orwell, 1984.